The smell of scorched coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the distant sizzle of eggs on an old grill. Malley's diner had always been a place where time moved slower, where truckers passed the salt like old friends, and the jukebox skipped every third song. But on that Thursday morning, something darker pressed in from the edges, a heaviness that the sunlight through the blinds couldn't chase away. Wendy Thomas sat at booth 5, a spot she chose every week for the sunlight it caught. The warmth was welcome on days her legs felt colder than usual, not from weather, but memory. She rolled in quietly like she always did, smiled at the waitress, ordered pancakes with extra strawberries, and waited for the world to forget she existed. But this time, someone remembered her, and not kindly. At the booth beside hers, two young men in hooded jackets leaned in too close, their breath heavy with stale nicotine and something meaner. Joseph Higbee, all cocky grins and sharp elbows, whispered something to Leon Brewer, then turned to Wendy with a smirk that made her stomach tighten. The first insult was quiet. The second was louder. The third came with the back of his hand, a slap that echoed louder than the bell above the diner door. "Cripple princess thinks she's better than us?" Joseph sneered, grabbing the edge of her tray and flipping it onto her lap. Silverware clattered. Syrup splattered. Conversations died in mid-sentence. No one moved. The cook froze behind the pass window. The waitress backed into the counter like she could disappear. Even the man reading the paper near the door lowered it slowly, then looked away. Wendy didn't scream. She didn't cry. But her hands shook, her body locked in place, the wheels of her chair unmoved, like her dignity, pinned by the weight of every stare that wouldn't meet hers. And as the bullies chuckled and nudged each other proudly, something inside her folded in, a soft part of her spirit trying hard not to shatter. If you've ever felt the sting of being different, the ache of watching cruelty go unchecked, or the helplessness of being surrounded by silence, this story is for you. Because what happened next wasn't about revenge. It was about power. And what it looks like when it's used to protect instead of destroy. Wendy had lived through worse. A crash at 16 had stolen her ability to walk, but not her will. She studied hard, wrote harder, and forced herself out of bed every Thursday for this ritual: pancakes, a book, and the illusion of normalcy. But this morning didn't offer her peace. It offered her humiliation sharp enough to slice through years of progress. She tried to will herself back from the table, but Joseph leaned in again, his breath hot in her ear. "Not done yet," he muttered, tapping the side of her chair with his boot. She froze. The waitress looked like she might cry but said nothing. No one did. Wendy's heart pounded. Not from fear. From rage. Then came the sound, soft, controlled, wrong for the setting. A low growl of an engine outside. Not a motorcycle. Not a truck. A car, purring like a predator. Heads turned toward the window. A sleek black Alfa Romeo pulled into the lot, its chrome catching the morning sun. Doors opened. 3 men stepped out, suited, silent. One of them held a hat in his hand like it was an extension of his name. Marco Cremonesi had arrived. And the diner would never be the same again. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. Wendy didn't lift her eyes when the laughter returned. It clung to the air like cigarette smoke, thick, choking, unwelcome. Her tray still lay overturned on the floor, its contents soaking into the hem of her jeans, the syrup sticky and cold on her thighs. She could feel the weight of everyone's silence pressing down on her, heavier than the insult, heavier even than the slap. And when Joseph snorted and leaned in again, the air felt thinner still. "You want out of here?" Joseph murmured, lips curled into a smirk. His sneaker nudged the wheel of her chair again, not enough to hurt, but enough to dominate. Leon snickered behind him, drumming his fingers on the booth table like this was all just a fun little song. Wendy clenched her jaw. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a whimper. The waitress hadn't moved. Her hands trembled around a coffee pot, knuckles white, lips parted as if caught between a scream and an apology. She met Wendy's eyes for a moment, then looked away, cheeks flushed with shame. Behind the counter, the cook had vanished from view, though she could hear his nervous shuffle, like a rabbit crouched behind a hedge, praying the fox would move on. Wendy had never hated silence so much. It wasn't supposed to be like this, not again. The diner had been her sanctuary for 3 years. Every Thursday at 9 a.m., she rolled through those doors, placed the same order, and sank into the comfort of pancakes and routine. No one asked about her legs. No one pitied her. That was all she needed. Until today. Her hands trembled as she reached for the napkin holder. Syrup smeared her fingers as she fumbled for something to clean herself with, not because she thought it would help, but because doing something, anything, felt better than sitting in the humiliation. Her vision blurred, not from tears, but from a white-hot fog of fury and helplessness. She blinked hard, refusing to let a single tear fall in front of them. That's what they wanted. 6 years ago, it had been a rainy afternoon, the kind of rain that came down in curtains and made everything shimmer like a dream. She remembered music playing loud in the car, her younger cousin laughing in the passenger seat. She remembered the scream of tires, the crunch of metal, the glass that glittered in the air like broken stars. She remembered the silence that followed, and the paramedic's voice saying, "Don't try to move, sweetheart." The damage had been instant and irreversible. Spine severed. T10. The words were cold, technical, delivered like a diagnosis for a broken appliance. 16 years old, full of ambition, and suddenly locked into a body that didn't do what she told it to. For the first month, she didn't speak. For the second, she didn't cry. But by the third, she made a promise to herself. She would not become a victim. She would not be the story people whispered about with pity in their eyes and charity in their voices. She signed up for online classes. She took up writing short essays about hope, identity, invisibility. And she made a ritual out of Thursdays, the one day she left her apartment, rolled through the world like it still belonged to her, and ate pancakes under the sun-dappled windows of Malley's diner. Now, the ritual had shattered. Joseph's mockery had cracked it wide open, and the silence of the others, the waitress, the cook, the man with the paper, had driven the splinters deeper. Wendy stared at the black and white checkered floor, at the syrup congealing into sticky puddles around her wheels. She wanted to scream, to shove Joseph away, to demand that someone, anyone, stand up for her. But her voice stayed trapped in her chest, choked by years of being polite, of being easy to ignore. "Not so tough now, huh?" Leon chuckled, tapping her chair. "You act like you own this booth. You don't own anything, Wheels." The worst part wasn't the words. It was that everyone heard them. Everyone knew what was happening. And no one, not a single person, moved. She was alone, surrounded by people. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair tightly, trying to anchor herself to something solid, something real. The heat in her cheeks burned, not from embarrassment, but from rage that had no place to go. She thought of the stories she'd written about bravery, about dignity, about refusing to be erased. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Her dignity had been stripped and scattered across the floor with her pancakes. She wanted to disappear. To melt into the tile and vanish under the booths where the world's cruelty couldn't reach her. But even that escape was stolen from her, her chair made sure of it. She couldn't run. She could only sit, exposed and humiliated. Outside, a car door slammed. A single sound, distant, precise, but somehow louder than all the laughter inside. Wendy didn't look up at first. She was too far inside herself, too lost in the firestorm behind her eyes. But then the air shifted. It wasn't the kind of shift that came from noise. It was the kind that came with presence. The diner, once thick with the smug heat of mockery, cooled instantly, like someone had cracked a window in a burning room. Wendy blinked. The silence was different now. The laughter stopped. Joseph's hand dropped from her chair. Leon froze mid-sip of his orange juice. Somewhere near the door, the bell jingled, just once, soft, almost polite. But every eye in the diner had already turned toward the entrance, as if pulled by invisible thread. She heard the sound of polished shoes on tile. Slow, unhurried, confident. And then a voice, low, measured, terrifyingly calm. "Is there a reason this young lady is bleeding syrup while you all sip your coffee?" Her spine stiffened instinctively. She didn't recognize the voice, not yet, but it carried weight. Authority. And danger. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask questions. It gave warnings dressed as curiosity. Wendy turned her head slowly. And there he was. Tall. Impeccably dressed in a black suit, his eyes like iron beneath dark brows. Marco Cremonesi. The name filtered through her thoughts like a myth stepping into daylight. Behind him stood two others, one with gray at his temples and hands like stone, the other younger, sharper, his expression unreadable. The cook ducked beneath the pass window. The waitress gasped. Joseph's face drained of color. Leon's jaw twitched. Wendy blinked, unsure if this was real or a dream. If the universe had somehow sent her an avenging ghost in a tailored suit. Or if she'd finally gone numb and was hallucinating power in the place where dignity used to live. But Marco's eyes met hers. And he nodded, just once. It was the first time anyone had looked at her all morning, not with pity, not with fear, but with acknowledgement. Recognition. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the syrup, the bruises, the silence, something shifted. The engine whispered into the parking lot like a secret, low and controlled. Every conversation inside the diner seemed to dissolve mid-sentence, as if someone had pulled the plug on sound itself. Wendy didn't look up at first, still caught in the throes of humiliation, syrup on her lap, her fists clenched on the wheels of her chair. But she felt it, the shift in the air, the drop in temperature, the kind of stillness that comes right before lightning hits. Across the linoleum, even Joseph froze, his lazy smirk faltering as he turned toward the glass. Outside, a sleek black Alfa Romeo rolled to a stop just inches from the front steps. The chrome glinted like a blade in the morning sun, and the license plate bore no numbers, only a symbol no one dared claim aloud. The passenger door opened first. Enzo, thick-necked and silent, stepped out, his knuckles bruised from old memories, eyes scanning the street like a dog who never forgot how to bite. From the driver's side came Dario, younger, sharper, eyes narrowed behind dark lenses. Then the back door eased open, and time seemed to stall. Marco Cremonesi rose from the back seat, adjusting the cuff of his black wool suit with the same care a surgeon might take before cutting into flesh. His fedora rested lightly in one hand. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence moved faster than his steps. The moment he crossed the threshold into the diner, the bell above the door jingled softly, an innocent sound that only sharpened the tension already crackling in the air. Every patron turned, slowly, instinctively, like prey registering the scent of something bigger. Knives paused mid-butter. Spoons hovered over coffee. A man near the window muttered under his breath, "Is that?" but never finished the sentence. Joseph leaned back slightly in his booth, trying to straighten his hoodie like that might somehow make him invisible. Leon, suddenly pale, dropped his fork with a loud clink. Wendy's breath caught in her chest as Marco's eyes passed over the room like high beams slicing through fog. They didn't settle on Joseph first. They found her. It wasn't a stare of pity. Not curiosity. It was clinical, precise, like he was taking stock of damage and reading the space around her like a battlefield. Then his gaze cut cleanly to Joseph, lingering just long enough to make the air feel sharp. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Marco walked forward with the silence of a man who had nothing left to prove. Dario and Enzo flanked him, clearing a path without touching a soul. He reached booth 5 and paused, eyes on Wendy, and then tilted his head slightly, an unspoken question. "May I?" he asked, voice low but crisp. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask for permission so much as observe formality. Wendy nodded, unsure why, but unafraid. Marco slid onto the bench across from her and set his hat gently on the table beside her overturned juice glass. Enzo stood behind him like a shadow, arms folded. Dario remained near the door, one hand tucked inside his jacket. For a moment, it was just Wendy and Marco, the sounds of the diner muffled like she was underwater. Then Marco spoke. "You laid hands on her?" His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was colder than steel and more final than judgment. Joseph blinked, opened his mouth, and never got the words out. Enzo moved like a hammer. With one clean swing, He struck Joseph square across the jaw, sending him sprawling off the booth, his head bouncing once on the linoleum. The sound was sickening, not the thud of a bar brawl, but the deliberate percussion of justice. Leon screamed something incoherent and bolted from the booth, knocking over a chair on his way out the back. No one chased him. No one needed to. Joseph groaned, barely conscious, his cheeks swelling instantly. The silence in the diner deepened, not from fear, but from knowing. Wendy glanced around and saw something new in every face. Awe, guilt, relief. No one moved to help him. No one dared. Marco didn't look down at the boy he'd just sentenced. His gaze stayed on Wendy. "What's your name?" he asked, softer now. "Wendy," she managed, voice shaking. He nodded slowly. "My mother fell outside this diner 2 weeks ago," he said. "You were the one who helped her up. You stayed with her. You called the ambulance." The memory rushed back, an elderly woman, gray coat, blood on her lip, clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her standing. Wendy had wrapped a scarf around the woman's arm to stop the bleeding. She hadn't even known her name. She said the girl in the wheelchair had more courage than the rest of the city combined, Marco said quietly. "She's the only reason I'm here." Enzo nudged Joseph with his shoe, flipping him onto his back like garbage being sorted. "That one thought you were alone," Marco added. He was mistaken. Marco reached into his coat, and for a split second, even the air held its breath. But it wasn't a gun he drew. It was a black silk scarf, folded neatly, embroidered with a red wolf and thorns. He reached across the table and laid it gently across Wendy's shoulders. "Your family now," he said. The waitress gasped behind the counter. The cook dropped something metallic. A few customers whispered the word Cremonesi, like it was a prayer and a curse rolled into one. Wendy didn't speak. She couldn't. Her body shook, but it wasn't from fear. It was from being seen. Marco stood slowly and looked around the diner. His voice cut through the room like a blade. "If she's ever disrespected again, even looked at wrong, you answer to me." No one objected. No one blinked. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to pause. He turned back to Wendy and slid a small black card across the table, blank except for the red wolf insignia. "You ever need me," he said, "call this. I won't ask questions." Then he reached down, adjusted the knot of her scarf like a father would a daughter's tie before church, and tipped his hat. Enzo pulled Joseph to his feet like dead weight and dragged him toward the door, his feet scraping across tile. Dario opened the door. As Marco passed through it, he gave the room one final glance, no words, just that chilling silence again. And then they were gone. The bell jingled once more, but this time it didn't feel innocent. It felt like a sentence. Wendy remained still for a moment, her fingers clutched around the scarf now resting against her chest. It was heavier than it looked. Or maybe it just meant more than it looked. When she glanced up, the waitress was crying silently behind the counter. The cook peeked over the pass, eyes wide. No one said a word. But they all knew. Booth 5 had changed forever. Have you ever seen someone stand up for someone else when no one else would, even in a small, quiet way? What happened, and how did it change you? Drop your story in the comments below. Your courage might inspire someone else to take action when it matters most. Wendy sat motionless as the scarf settled across her shoulders. It was soft, impossibly soft, but the weight of it pressed into her chest like armor forged from reputation and debt repaid. Her breath came shallow as she looked down at the embroidered symbol, a blood-red rose, curled in thorns, blooming against a black background. She didn't need to ask what it meant. She knew. It meant Marco Cremonesi didn't forget favors and didn't let anyone hurt people he considered his own. Marco remained still after placing the scarf, eyes unreadable beneath the shadow of his brow. Then he said it, plainly, without flourish. "You helped my mother. I repay my debts." The words struck harder than any punch Enzo had thrown. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged Wendy's quiet act, the moment she'd thought no one saw, no one would remember. Weeks earlier, it had been raining, not hard, but enough to slick the sidewalks and catch unsuspecting feet. Wendy had just finished her breakfast at Malley's, rolling out slowly, her fingers chilled against the damp metal of her wheels. That's when she saw the older woman stumble. Her coat was too heavy, her shoes too thin, and her knees hit the concrete with a crack that made Wendy flinch. Without thinking, Wendy wheeled to her side. The woman was in pain, her breath short, one hand clutching her hip and the other still trying to hold onto a purse with gold clasps. People walked by. A man on the phone paused, glanced, then continued on. A woman with a dog looked once and hurried across the street. But Wendy stayed. She pressed the emergency button on her phone, offered tissues from her bag, and whispered calming words through the storm of the woman's panic. "Don't move too fast," Wendy had said gently. "You may have fractured something." The woman's eyes had been wide with pain, but she listened. When the paramedics arrived, Wendy gave them her coat to cover the woman and didn't leave until they did. Not once did she ask for thanks. Not once did she imagine this moment would come back around. But Marco had found her. "She told me," he said now, voice low, even. "The girl with the quiet eyes and the stubborn heart. She said the world ignored her, but you didn't." Wendy's throat tightened. No one had ever described her that way, and certainly not with such precision. At that moment, Dario dragged Joseph toward the exit like a sack of shame. Joseph barely protested now, his body limp, cheek swelling, blood at the corner of his mouth. Wendy watched as the boy who'd called her names now looked like one small, trembling, forgotten. The back door of the diner slammed shut behind them. Leon, his sidekick in cowardice, had long since vanished, probably already trying to convince himself it hadn't happened at all. Marco's voice rang out again, this time for everyone. "This woman is not to be touched again." He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. "She is under my protection." The phrase dropped into the silence like a sacred oath. All around the diner, heads bowed slightly, eyes flickering toward Wendy with new light, not pity now, but respect. The same people who had once looked away when she was slapped now looked like they would rise if she were touched again. Power had shifted. And Marco had made sure it stuck. He turned to the waitress, the one with trembling hands and guilt on her face. "What's her usual?" he asked. She blinked, startled. "Pancakes, extra strawberries. Fresh squeezed orange juice," she added, almost whispering. Marco nodded, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a thick wad of cash, crisp and folded. "Feed her," he said, placing it on the counter. "Every Thursday. Every week. It's on us." The waitress stared at the money like it might explode. Behind her, the cook peeked over the edge of the kitchen pass window. Marco didn't bother looking at him, but his presence said enough. "You saw what happened. You know what not to let happen again." Wendy wanted to speak, to thank him, to say something human, but the words stuck. Her throat burned with the pressure of it all. She had come in for pancakes and peace. She had received humiliation, fear, and then something she still couldn't name. It wasn't rescue. It wasn't pity. It was honor. Marco reached into his coat once more and slid a small black card across the table. There was no name, no number, just a crimson crest, pressed in deep the rose and thorns, identical to the one on the scarf now hugging her shoulders. "Keep it close," he said. "You don't need to explain it. Just show it." Wendy picked it up with slow fingers, her hand trembling as she traced the emblem. It felt like more than a card. It felt like a line, a boundary, one no one would cross again. Marco stood. "You're not invisible," he said quietly, as if repeating something sacred. "Never were. They just chose not to look." He turned then, adjusting his cuffs as he moved back toward the door, his steps measured and calm. Enzo nodded at Wendy as he passed. Dario held the door open. The bell jingled softly as Marco stepped into the light. And then he was gone. The moment stretched long after the door shut behind him. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence had changed. It wasn't paralyzed anymore. It was respectful, reverent. The waitress wiped her eyes and brought Wendy a clean napkin, followed by a fresh plate of pancakes with extra strawberries and a new glass of orange juice. She placed them gently in front of her. "On the house," she whispered, though they both knew it wasn't her house anymore. Wendy smiled faintly. The syrup still clung to her jeans. Her cheek still ached from the slap. But she no longer felt small. Not today. Because today, power had sat beside her. Not to hurt. Not to use. But to honor a quiet kindness no one else had noticed. And to remind the world that some debts are paid not with money, but with protection. Wendy looked at the scarf again. The rose. The thorns. And she knew she'd never be invisible again. By the next morning, the story had already mutated into legend. It left the linoleum tiles of Malley's diner and slipped through the town like cigarette smoke under a door, impossible to contain. Everyone had their own version. Some said Marco Cremonesi snapped Joseph's arm clean in two, others swore the mobster shot out the diner lights to make a point. No one mentioned Wendy by name, but they all referred to her the girl in the wheelchair with the scarf, the one who sat across from the man in the black suit like she belonged there. And in a way, now she did. The waitress, who once froze with fear, now watched Wendy with quiet reverence each Thursday, refilling her coffee without being asked, folding napkins with unnecessary precision. The cook, who hadn't spoken a word that day, nodded solemnly whenever she wheeled in, like he was bowing without bowing. The other regulars, the ones who had once looked through her like glass, now straightened up when she passed, offering soft greetings and avoiding her gaze. There was no more whispering behind menus. Just silence, thick with respect. The police came around 2 days later. 2 detectives in tired suits and even more tired eyes strolled in with notebooks and polite smiles, asking about a possible altercation. They spoke to the waitress, to the cook, even to the man by the window who always read the paper. But every response was the same, vague, confused, useless. "I think he tripped," the cook said with a shrug, referring to Joseph. "Big feet, small brain." The detectives tried pressing, but no one cracked. They didn't mention Marco by name. Didn't have to. The unspoken wall around the event was made of stone. No one wanted to be the one who broke the silence or earned Cremonesi attention. Wendy watched it all from her booth. She said nothing. Not out of fear, but choice. What had happened didn't need explaining. It had been clear. Brutal. Just. And deeply, irrevocably understood. Outside of the diner, the changes came more slowly, but they came. The old man at the newspaper stand who never spoke to her before now tipped his cap. A local florist refused her payment for a bouquet she picked out. And Tony, the grizzled mechanic down on Bay Street, offered to fix the rattle in her wheelchair's left wheel, free of charge. He didn't explain why. "You roll different now," he said simply. Respect. Wendy hadn't changed, not really. She still wrote late at night. Still read in the mornings. Still wrestled with the sting of that slap in quiet moments. But now, the world around her shifted like a house that had creaked into a new foundation. People saw her, really saw her, and whether it was fear or admiration, it made them look twice. And Marco's name? It began to stir again like a buried myth refusing to stay dead. Whispers of him returned to bar corners and poker tables. No one said it loudly. But you could hear it in phrases like "the old ways," or "the suit with the red wolf," or "he's back, and he's still got teeth." Some people said it with awe. Others with anxiety. A few with envy. Kids who used to graffiti walls started scratching tiny red roses beside their tags, not for art, but for protection. An ex-bouncer down at Club Ember muttered to a bartender, "Cremonesi's back in the city." And he brought wolves. And suddenly, people were remembering favors they owed, debts unpaid, and promises broken. The ripples were turning into waves. Joseph Higbee wasn't seen for a full week. When he finally emerged, limping down the alley behind his apartment complex, eyes swollen and bruises yellowing across his jaw, no one said a word. He kept his head low, wore a hood even in the sunlight, and never walked the block near Malley's again. Some said he was banned. Others said he was scared stiff. Either way, his arrogance was gone, burned out of him like poison from a wound. Leon had skipped town. One moment he was crashing on his cousin's couch. The next he was gone, just a dent in the mattress and a half-empty can of Red Bull. Rumor was he left the state entirely. Wendy didn't care. She didn't need to see him run. His silence was its own confession. Wendy found herself thinking about Marco more than she expected. Not in fear. In curiosity. Who is he really? She'd heard whispers that he ran things without needing to shout, that he once ended a drug ring by sending a single white envelope that the wolves who followed him didn't question, just obeyed. But none of that matched the man who adjusted her scarf like a father might, or who remembered his mother's injury with the clarity of someone who truly listened. She Googled him once. The results were sparse, a few news clippings from years ago about suspected racketeering, old arrests that went nowhere, property purchases in dummy names. But nothing solid. No photos. Just shadows and suggestions. Marco Cremonesi existed on the periphery of power, but never at its center. Wendy closed the laptop and stared at the scarf hanging on her coat rack. Still folded neatly. Still untouched. There were days she thought about wearing it out, letting the city see. But she didn't. Not yet. Not until she knew what it really meant to wear it. Because being protected by someone like Marco, that wasn't something you wore lightly. Still, there were moments, brief ones, where she felt it, walking past the mayor's office and seeing the guards nod, or overhearing a man at a bus stop say, "Don't mess with that one." Booth 5. The town had changed. Not on the surface, but underneath. Like pressure before a quake. And Wendy, once invisible, was now a landmark. Have you ever witnessed power shift in a way that changed how someone was treated, maybe even how you were treated? What did it reveal about the people around you? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else recognize quiet strength when they see it. From the outside, the Cremonesi compound looked like nothing more than a restored glass factory, brick walls aged by time, iron gates that squeaked when the wind pushed too hard, and security cameras no more obvious than ivy on the fence. But inside, the place was a fortress woven together by tradition, blood, and silence. No one got in without permission. No one got out without being noticed. It wasn't just Marco's home, it was the last stronghold of a fading legacy, where loyalty was currency and history never forgot. The world had moved on from families like the Cremonesis, or at least it liked to pretend it had. But in the corners of cities and in the shadows of laws that didn't protect the weak, old codes still held weight. Marco had inherited the name, but he'd rewritten the rules. He didn't sell drugs. He didn't touch human trafficking. His empire stood not on vice, but on power, precision, and promises kept. People feared him, yes. But even more than fear, they respected him. Marco Cremonesi didn't yell. He didn't bluff. He didn't make threats. He made statements. And when he said something, it stayed said. In the compound's upper floor, part office, part war room, Enzo leaned against the wide windows, eyes fixed on the skyline. Below, Dario was pacing, a cigarette half-burned between his fingers, still rattled from what had gone down at the diner. The silence between them stretched long until Enzo finally muttered, "He only raises hell when it's deserved." Dario paused mid-step. "You think that girl was worth it?" Enzo didn't look away from the skyline. "It wasn't about worth," he said. "That was a blood oath." He took a breath, long and slow, like drawing from the past. "You weren't around when he lost his sister." "But I was." Her name was Luciana, and she had been the light of Marco's boyhood, 5 years younger, smart as fire and kinder than anyone had a right to be. She walked with braces on her legs, born with a condition doctors didn't bother naming after the third specialist. The neighborhood kids called her limp the ghost step. But she never let it slow her down. And Marco worshipped the ground she limped on. Luciana had been 13 when it happened, cornered after school by 3 boys who thought kindness was weakness. They mocked her voice, took her books, knocked her to the pavement and laughed while she bled. One of them spit on her. And though she never told Marco the full story, Enzo remembered the moment he found out. He was 16, Enzo said, turning now to Dario. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He sat at the edge of her bed, held her hand, and asked one question. Who? Dario didn't speak. He knew what came next without needing the words. By morning, all 3 boys had broken noses. One had a shattered wrist. Another didn't walk right for months. No charges were filed, no witnesses came forward. And the name Cremonesi began to mean something different in that town. That's where the rule came from, Enzo said. We don't harm the innocent. But if someone else does, we don't let it slide. He turned back to the window. That girl in the diner, she reminded him. Dario dropped the cigarette in a steel tray, crushed it under his palm. "You think she knows?" he asked. "What she stirred up?" "No," Enzo said. "And that's good. Because power only works when the people you protect don't fear it." Downstairs, Marco sat alone in the boardroom, a long walnut table in front of him, the walls lined with black and white photographs of men who had built the old world with blood and silence. He didn't look at them. He was looking at the black card, the one he'd given Wendy, now replicated on a screen in front of him. He was considering digitizing the system, making a database of protection markers. But he hesitated. The card wasn't about convenience. It was about weight. It had been Enzo's idea to brand the wolf in thorns, strength wrapped in pain. Marco approved it because it reminded him of Luciana. She used to draw wolves when she was little, saying they weren't monsters, they were protectors who just didn't like crowds. He had remembered that, and now, years later, her spirit lived on in the codes he enforced. The rules were old, but they weren't without mercy. You could walk away from business. You could fall in love. You could even leave the family if you did it with respect. But the one rule no one broke was this: you do not touch the voiceless. You do not strike the defenseless. You do not harm the kind. What Marco had done at the diner wasn't vengeance. It was balance. He knew Joseph's type. Empty pride. Weak spine. A man who thought strength was measured by who you could step on. Marco had seen hundreds like him. And he had broken every single one, not out of rage, but out of necessity. It wasn't always like this. In his 20s, Marco had tried going legit. He opened a shipping company, tried to leave the name behind. But the world didn't let go. Politicians still whispered his family name like a disease. Cops still followed him without cause. And his enemies kept testing him. So he stopped apologizing for the name. Instead, he made it mean something better. Dario entered the room now, carrying a file. "The councilman's nephew is asking questions," he said. "Wants to know what you want in return for sparing the boy." Marco raised an eyebrow. "I don't want anything," he said. Dario blinked. "Nothing." Marco leaned back, folded his hands. The message was the payment. "They'll think twice next time." "And the girl?" "She doesn't owe me a thing." He tapped the screen. "That card stays valid for life." Enzo joined them, arms folded. "She reminded you of Luciana," he said flatly. Marco's eyes flicked to him, but he didn't answer right away. Then he said, "No. She reminded me that we can still be who we were even now." There was silence in the room again, but this one wasn't heavy. It was full of clarity. Like the calm after a storm when all that remains is what matters. "You think she'll call it in?" Dario asked. Marco looked out the window toward the edge of the city skyline. "Maybe," he said, "but I hope she never has to." The headline hit like a slap Wendy hadn't seen coming. Mob ties at Malley's? Wheelchair woman rescued by known criminal. Her heart sank as she read the first paragraph, each sentence curling with insinuation. The article painted her as a poor, helpless girl manipulated by Marco Cremonesi to revive his fearsome image. Words like calculated spectacle, mob optics, and manufactured heroism leapt from the page, crueler than Joseph's slap ever was. The reporter, a man named Dale Voss, used her name once, then referred to her as the disabled woman for the rest of the piece. He described the scarf as a branding tool, the diner event as a publicity stunt, and Marco as a ghost of organized crime clinging to relevance. The tone was clear. This wasn't about justice. It was about spin. And Wendy could practically hear the clicks and shares rack up as people devoured the poison. By mid-morning, the story had made local television. Her inbox filled with subject lines she didn't dare open. People from high school, the ones who never called, never cared, messaged her with half-curious, half-pitying lines like, "Wow, is it true? And did he pay you to be there?" The worst part? Even some of her neighbors, the ones who'd waved at her days ago, suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. The respect she had earned, the silence charged with awe, now felt like suspicion dressed in silence. She stayed inside that Thursday. For the first time in over 3 years, she missed pancakes at Malley's. Her chair sat idle by the door, scarf still folded over its back like a promise she wasn't sure she could trust. She couldn't decide what hurt more, The idea that people believed she was a pawn, or the fear that maybe, just maybe, she was. Doubt clawed through her chest like rust eating through old steel. She reread the article 4 times, searching for something redeeming, something human. There was none. It was too neat, too venomous. It read like someone wanted Marco discredited. Someone with resources. Someone pulling strings behind the curtain. And then she saw it buried in the article's credits. Story supported by the office of Councilman Randall Higbee. Her blood turned to ice. Higbee. Joseph's uncle. Of course. The attack, the humiliation, the slap, they weren't random. Joseph hadn't just been a bully. He'd been protected. Connected. The story wasn't journalism. It was revenge, repackaged as reporting. Wendy paced in tight circles in her small living room, heart thundering. The scarf still lay draped over her chair like it was watching her, waiting. She wanted to call Marco, to demand answers, but what would she even say? Did you use me? Did you make me a symbol because it helped you look good? Then her phone rang. The name simply read, unknown caller. But she knew. She didn't hesitate. Hello. Wendy. Marco's voice came through the line, calm and even, like nothing had changed. I saw the article. I imagine you have questions. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. He continued. Before you ask anything, let me be clear. I asked for nothing from you. You owe me nothing. But you deserve to know the truth. She let out a shaky breath. It was Joseph's uncle. Wasn't it? Yes, Marco replied. Randall Higbee has hated my family for 20 years. He used his nephew's embarrassment to smear me and discredit you as collateral. Wendy swallowed hard. She felt anger bloom again, but not the helpless kind. This was righteous. I need to see you, she said. Not in a diner. Not in public. I need to look you in the eye. There was a pause. Then I'll send a car. Sunset. Bring only what you trust. She hung up without another word. There was nothing more to say. At 6:57 p.m., a sleek black car rolled up outside her apartment building. No emblem. No plates. No driver's name. But she recognized the familiarity, the silence wrapped in velvet. She rolled outside, scarf over her shoulders, the black card in her hand. The door opened for her. The ride was quiet. No questions. No radio. Just the steady hum of the road beneath them, the city blurring by like an afterthought. By the time they turned down a gravel drive shielded by thick hedges, her pulse had steadied into something like resolve. The Cremonesi compound was bigger than she expected, part fortress, part estate. Brick and iron. Glass and guns. But it wasn't cold. It wasn't menacing. It felt watchful. Marco waited for her in a wide corridor lined with black and white photographs, old men with haunted eyes and hands clasped at funerals, weddings, business tables. He wore no jacket. Just a dark shirt, sleeves rolled up, like the formality had been stripped for truth. You look tired, he said gently. I am, she replied. But I came anyway. He nodded once, then gestured for her to follow. They walked side by side through a room filled with artifacts, old ledgers, worn rosary beads, a faded toy wolf behind glass. Marco paused in front of it. My sisters, he said. Luciana. She used to say wolves protected what the world ignored. She was right, Wendy said quietly. He turned to her, eyes heavy but clear. That scarf I gave you? It wasn't branding. It was protection. Old world style. No press. No politics. Just a vow. She met his gaze. And the article? He exhaled through his nose. Higbee bought it. Voss wrote it. It won't stand. I don't want a retraction, she said. I want to understand what I'm part of. What I was pulled into. Marco considered her a moment, then walked to a table and pulled out a file. He handed it to her. Inside were photos of Joseph, of Councilman Higbee, of the two at fundraisers, at bars, at private events. Another document listed bank transfers, cash routed to a shell company tied to Dale Voss's media firm. He made you a target, Marco said. I shielded you. That's all. But now you know. Wendy sat, heart pounding. Why me? He looked at her long, and his answer was not theatrical. Not strategic. It was real. Because you saw my mother when she fell, he said. And you stayed. No cameras. No glory. Just compassion. And I owe that something. She stared down at the photos, then back at him. What now? Marco tilted his head. That's your choice. But know this, you aren't the story they want to write. You are the story they fear. Wendy expected Marco's private residence to look like a throne room, all sharp lines and shadows, walls thick with silence. But as she was led through a set of polished oak doors deeper into the Cremonesi compound, she found something unexpected: warmth. The lighting was dim but golden, not sterile. Soft jazz hummed from hidden speakers, and the scent of something roasted and herb-heavy drifted from a kitchen just out of sight. It was a house that had known family once, laughter, maybe even love, and somehow, it still carried the echoes. Wendy's guard didn't lower, but something inside her began to thaw. Marco stood at the head of a long wooden table, a glass of red wine untouched beside him. His black shirt sleeves were still rolled up, revealing forearms lined with scars too neat to be accidental. You came, he said, not as a question, but a quiet acknowledgement. Wendy nodded, eyes scanning the room like she was trying to see behind the walls. I had to, she replied. You don't drag someone into legend and expect them not to ask questions. He motioned for her to sit across from him, and she did, but not like a guest. More like a negotiator. A plate was placed in front of her moments later: roasted duck, saffron risotto, and winter vegetables arranged with care. She eyed it, then him. You don't seem like the linen napkin type, she said. Marco smiled faintly. My mother taught me that breaking bread makes truth easier to swallow. He took a sip of wine, then added, besides, if you're going to speak with devils, you should at least be well fed. Wendy allowed a small smile. You're not the devil, she said. But you make a damn good impersonation. They ate in measured silence for several minutes. The tension didn't vanish, but it matured, no longer a threat, but a recognition. Marco broke it with a question. What do you think justice looks like, Wendy? She chewed her food slowly before answering. It's not clean, she said. It's not always legal. But it's honest. It sees people, and it answers cruelty with weight. He nodded slowly. That's better than most judges I've heard. You scare people, she said then, eyes locking with his. You walk into rooms and time stops. They don't know whether to run or kneel. But you don't scare me. She leaned forward, voice steady. You scare everyone else. Marco didn't flinch. He met her gaze like two titans sizing up the space between them. Good, he said. They should be scared not of me, but of what happens when they forget that kindness isn't weakness. His voice dipped. The law doesn't work for everyone. So I make sure it does my way. She leaned back, her spine brushing the velvet chair. That sounds like justice with a loaded gun. He didn't deny it. Sometimes that's all justice understands. Wendy studied him in the soft light, this man who terrified bullies and whispered comfort to the broken. He didn't play God. He played balance. He moved like a storm but protected like a wall. She still didn't know if that made him dangerous or necessary. Marco stood and gestured toward a glass cabinet near the wall. Enzo, he called. Moments later, the older man entered the room and handed her a thin, sealed envelope. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were bank statements, text logs, and a printed chain of emails. Councilman Randall Higbee had directly funded Dale Vossa's investigation into the Malley's diner incident, not just encouraged it, but ordered it. There were payment records tied to a shell media firm. Even a draft headline, Crippled Girl or Criminal Pawn. The truth about Booth 5. Wendy's stomach churned. They wanted to erase what happened, Marco said. They didn't care about truth. They cared about control. And you were in the way. She looked up, the envelope trembling in her hands. Let me guess, this goes to your contacts next? Underground blogs? Whisper networks? He shook his head. No, that's not mine to decide. She frowned. Then why give it to me? Because you're the one they targeted. The one they underestimated. And if this truth is going to hurt them, it should come from the person they tried to silence. For a long moment, Wendy didn't speak. She thought about the article. About the looks in the grocery store. About the silence that replaced the nods she used to get. She could burn them back. Set their lies on fire. But if she did it Marco's way, The world would see her as his weapon, not her own woman. "I want this published," she said, placing the envelope back on the table. "But through a real source. A name that carries facts, not fire. And I want mine on it." Marco studied her like a general reading a new soldier's face. Then he smiled, small, proud, sincere. "As you wish," he said. "I know just the journalist." The tension between them didn't vanish, but it shifted into something more refined, not confrontation, but collaboration. He had power. She had truth. Together, they would reshape what the world thought it knew. They didn't toast. They didn't shake hands. They just nodded. The kind of nod that closes chapters and opens doors. As Wendy wheeled herself from the table, she paused at the edge of the room, fingers brushing the toy wolf behind the glass. "Luciana, right?" Marco's voice was soft. "Yes, she was lucky to have you." He looked at her, something fragile flickering in his eyes. "I was lucky to have her." Have you ever had someone try to twist your truth into their story, and if so, how did you take that power back? Share your answer in the comments. Your voice matters, and like Wendy, maybe it's time the world heard it straight from you. The correction ran 2 days later, just below the fold of the Sunday edition, not flashy, not loud, but unmistakably clear. Initial report contained factual errors. Wendy Thomas acted independently, was not connected to organized crime. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an acknowledgement, the closest the press ever came to admitting they got it wrong. Wendy read it at her kitchen table, coffee going cold beside her, fingers tracing the ink like it might smudge into something more real. A photo of her scarf had been included in the updated piece, this time framed with dignity, not accusation. The journalist, Dale Voss, hadn't written the correction. Someone else had, likely an editor with enough integrity or enough fear to set the record straight. The article made no mention of Marco, no mention of wolves or glass compounds or crimson crests. But it stated clearly, the payments from Councilman Higby's office were real. And that Wendy had not, as the original report claimed, been used. She had acted, and that made all the difference. 3 days after the correction went live, Randall Higby's office was raided by city investigators. No fanfare, no arrests on camera, just quiet men in dark suits carrying boxes through back doors. Wendy watched the footage later that night. No headlines tying the raid to her, no whispers of Marco's name in any official statement. But she knew. That kind of silence carried a signature. The city moved on fast, it always did. New scandals, new distractions. But Wendy? She returned to Malley's on a Thursday morning like nothing had changed. Except everything had. The diner still smelled like burnt coffee and cheap syrup, but now it held a reverence, like a chapel that remembered something sacred. When Wendy wheeled through the door, conversation dipped for half a second before it resumed, more gentle this time. The regulars looked up and nodded, not just at her, but in recognition. The cook gave her a thumbs up from behind the window. And the waitress, the same one who had once frozen in fear, placed the menu down and whispered, "Welcome back, Miss Thomas." Wendy smiled and rolled to booth 5, the same one she had sat in before everything spiraled into blood, headlines, and legacy. She laid the scarf neatly across the booth beside her and pulled out a pen. Her notebook waited, clean and quiet, the first blank page feeling like a fresh street after rain. She wasn't sure what she'd write, but she knew it would start here. 10 minutes passed before she noticed him. Joseph. He stood just inside the door, looking like a boy who had wandered too far into a forest he didn't understand. His hoodie was too large now, hanging off his shoulders, and his once slick hair hung limp over his forehead. He limped, slightly but visibly, and when he walked, he kept his head down like the ceiling might fall. He stopped halfway to her table, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Wendy looked up, her expression unreadable. Joseph didn't speak immediately. He glanced at the other booths, like he wasn't sure if someone might intervene or if he even deserved to be seen. Finally, his voice cracked the quiet. I just wanted to say He stopped. Swallowed. "I didn't know who you were." Wendy raised an eyebrow. "And who is that?" Joseph's eyes flinched. I didn't know you had people. Power. If I'd known," he stopped again, ashamed. That's the point, isn't it? Wendy said, voice cool but calm. You only respected me once someone else told you to. He stood there like a child who had touched fire and was still wondering why it burned. I wasn't raised like this, he murmured. I just got caught up. My uncle, he said, but the words fell apart under the weight of their own cowardice. Wendy nodded slowly, folding her napkin with precision. I don't want excuses, she said. And I don't want you to be sorry because you're scared. I want you to think about why you never saw me until it cost you something not to. Joseph swallowed again. I am sorry, he said finally. Wendy didn't respond. She simply held his gaze, steady, clear, unflinching. And then, the bell above the diner door rang. The entire room shifted like animals sensing a change in the wind. A black car had pulled into the lot moments earlier, and now Marco Cremonesi stepped inside, wearing a dark coat against the chill and a look that said this visit wasn't planned, but it was needed. Behind him, Enzo and Dario hovered just outside, unreadable behind tinted glasses. Marco scanned the room once. His eyes landed on Wendy, then on Joseph. Joseph visibly paled. Marco didn't say a word to him. He didn't have to. The tension in the room coiled like a loaded spring. Joseph took a step back, then another, then turned and hurried out the door like a man who had remembered a meeting with death and decided not to attend. Marco didn't follow. Instead, he walked slowly to booth 5, tipped his hat, and said with that same effortless calm, just checking on family. Wendy exhaled softly, the smallest smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I saved you a seat, she said, nodding to the spot across from her. He didn't sit. But he did glance at her notebook. Writing again? Trying. He nodded once, then looked toward the kitchen. Tell them her breakfast is covered for life. And if anyone has a problem with that, he let the sentence drift, unfinished but fully understood. Then he turned and walked back to the door. No fanfare. No lingering, just presence and the unmistakable weight of being seen. It had been 3 months since the day Marco walked into the diner and changed everything with a stare and a sentence. The city kept moving, the streets buzzed, politics roared, headlines twisted, but Wendy Thomas had changed in a way the world couldn't rewind. Her hands no longer trembled when she rolled into Malley's, and the scarf Marco gave her was no longer folded like a relic. She wore it now not for protection, but as a promise. Not to herself, but to others like her. Every Thursday, she took her place at booth 5, her favorite corner bathed in morning light. The waitress didn't ask for her order anymore. It came like clockwork, pancakes with extra strawberries, a glass of fresh squeezed orange juice, and a folded note from the kitchen that simply read, "You're seen." It was the same booth, the same view, the same menu. But the girl in that booth had been reborn. Wendy had started writing again, but not the quiet, anonymous blogs of her college days. Her op-eds ran in the Post, sometimes even syndicated across national columns. She wrote about dignity, about witnessing cruelty and choosing courage instead, about what it meant to live in a world where justice was selective and visibility was conditional. She didn't name names, didn't glorify Marco or vilify Joseph. She didn't need to. The power was in the truth, not in the spectacle. One piece titled, "The chair isn't the problem, the silence is," went viral. Another, "Protection shouldn't be privilege," stirred debate in academic circles. She didn't attend the panels she was invited to. She didn't go on TV. She stayed here at this booth, in the heart of her quiet revolution, letting her words reach the world while she remained still and strong. The diner had changed too. It was still Malley's, the menu was still laminated and the floors still squeaked near the counter, but something unspoken hovered over the booths like a layer of glass. The staff moved with intention. The patrons lowered their voices when Wendy rolled by, and newcomers were watched, not with suspicion, but with quiet accountability. No one said Marco's name, but everyone knew. The cook never told her how, but the security camera had been replaced with a sharper model. The cash register no longer jammed. And once, when a man bumped into Wendy's chair without apology, a suited man from the back booth stood up and stared until the man muttered sorry and left his coffee unpaid. That man, she never got his name, tipped his hat before disappearing out the back. Just like Marco. Every Thursday, without fail, a single red rose arrived. No card. No signature. Just the bloom, placed delicately at the edge of her booth before she arrived. Sometimes it sat in a glass vase. Sometimes it rested against her napkin. Always the same rose. Always from him. He never came inside again, not since that day he said, just checking on family. But his presence lingered. Like a shadow that didn't threaten, but watched. It wasn't oppressive. It was protective. The kind of protection that lets you breathe on your own. Wendy never called the number on the black card. She still had it, tucked into the inner pocket of her bag, edges worn now, the embossed crest smoothed by time. She knew what it meant. And she knew she didn't need to use it yet. But knowing it was there made her feel more grounded than any therapy session ever had. She no longer thought about Joseph, or Councilman Higby, or even Dale Voss. They'd faded like the final notes of a bad song. What she did think about, more often than she expected, was Luciana. The girl who used to draw wolves and believed they were guardians, not monsters. Wendy hadn't met her, but somehow she felt like she carried her forward. One woman who couldn't walk, honoring another who never stopped fighting. That Thursday, Wendy was halfway through her orange juice when she noticed something near the entrance. A girl. 16, maybe 17. Ponytail. Glasses too big for her face. In a chair not unlike Wendy's, only a little older, more worn, the kind issued by hospitals, not chosen for comfort. She looked out of place and uncertain. Her mother, distracted on the phone, had already taken a booth and left her daughter trailing behind. The girl tried to follow, but the tables were tightly packed and her hands fumbled on the wheels. She bumped into a chair. No one moved. A few customers glanced, then turned back to their meals. The mother didn't notice. Wendy watched it all unfold in silence. The girl bit her lip. Wendy could see the sting in her eyes, the way her shoulders tried to shrink. She was trying not to be seen, trying not to make a scene. It was a moment Wendy knew too well, the moment where you learn the world wasn't built for you, and people are all too happy to prove it. Wendy didn't hesitate. She rolled out from booth 5, scarf trailing behind her like a banner, and glided across the diner in smooth, practiced turns. The clatter of plates, the murmur of conversation, it all softened. She stopped beside the girl and smiled. "Need help?" The girl blinked, startled, then nodded. "Yeah. Sorry. It's just tight." "No need to apologize for the world's poor design," Wendy said, voice light but warm. Together, they navigated the chairs. Wendy held one aside, made space, waited for the girl to slide in beside her mother, who finally looked up and mouthed a distracted thanks. Wendy nodded, then turned to leave, but not before the girl whispered, "I've read your articles." "You're her." The girl from booth 5. Wendy paused. Smiled. "I am." She rolled back to her seat, passing her rose on the way. She picked it up, placed it on the edge of the girl's table, and returned to her booth without fanfare. And as the sun spilled through the windows, casting golden light across the room, the scarf around her shoulders fluttered slightly in the breeze from the vent above. Wendy picked up her pen, opened her notebook, and wrote the first line of her next piece. Sometimes justice doesn't come in a uniform. Sometimes it comes in silence, wearing a suit. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.